Week 17 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few defenses I'd look to get on the wire this week. So if you made the championship in your fantasy leagues, congratulations. The first one is the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts here, they lead the league in turnovers, them and the Dallas Cowboys this year here. And this team, they just got a knack for ball hawking and making plays. So the last few weeks here for this Colt defense, week 13 at Houston, a monster fantasy day. They pitched a shutout, 4 sacks, interception, a fumble recovery. Week 15 versus the Patriots, 17 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions, including a pick six, a block kick. And then week 16 at Arizona, 16 points allowed, a safety in that one. So right here, week 17, a good matchup versus Derek Carr and the Las Vegas Raiders that give up the 14th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And I think the Colts here, they're going to go out there again, make some plays. Derek Carr turns the ball over once or twice a game, and I think they could get past that offensive line and get a few sacks. So the Colts right now, they're available not that many fantasy leagues at only 45%, but right here their owning should be more, especially with the good matchup and for the amount of turnovers they've been causing this year. The next defense I'd look to add this week's the Chicago Bears, so a 1 week ad for the most part. He is the Chicago Bear defense, and they got a great pass rusher this year in Robert Quinn, who's trying to break all types of sack records, and he might do it with 2 games left. So the last few games here for the Bears, week 14 at Green Bay, 39 points allowed, 3 sacks and a return touchdown. Week 15 versus Minnesota, 17 points allowed in that one, 4 sacks in it though. And then week 16 at Seattle in a ball game that was snowing most of the day, 24 points allowed, 2 sacks. So right here, week 17, like I mentioned, it's a 1 week ad only for the most part, with a great matchup versus the Giants that give up the 9th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And right here, Jake Fromm was starting for the Giants. He didn't look any good versus the Philadelphia Eagles, in my opinion. And I think this bad defense could get a few sacks in this game, make the youngster Fromm make a few turnovers. And like I mentioned, they're 1 week ad, and they're available right now in Chicago in 84% of fantasy leagues. The next defense I look to get the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans here, they've been a hit-or-miss defense for the most part of the season. But when they put up games, they really put up numbers, is Tennessee. And the last few weeks for them, week 12 at New England, a horrible ball game, 36 points allowed and only a sack. Week 14 versus Jacksonville, 3 sacks, 4 interceptions, and a shutout. Week 15 at Pittsburgh, 19 points allowed, 3 sacks. And week 16 versus a pretty good San Francisco 49er offense, 17 points allowed, 2 sacks and 2 wins. So week 17, a pretty good matchup versus the Dolphins that give up the 11th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And we just don't know what Tua Tagovailoa is going to show up. It seems like every other week it's one good game and one bad game for Tua. And right here, I think Tennessee at home can make a few plays, and that's where their defense plays the best here, is Tennessee, when they're home. And in this one in week 17 versus Miami, they're home. And I think they could have a decent ball game, and they're available in 59% of fantasy leagues. And the next defense I look to get this week is the New York Giants. I don't know, the Giants defense have been piss poor this season here. But once again, it's a matchup-based type of thing for me with the Giants, with a good matchup in week 17 at the Bears that give up the 5th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So Justin Fields should be back in this ball game from his ankle injury. And he's been a turnover-prone quarterback, and a quarterback that's taken a decent amount of sacks as well this season here. So the last few games for this Giant defense, week 14 at the Chargers, 37 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 15 versus the Cowboys, 21 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. And week 16 at Philly, 28 points allowed and a sack. So right here, like I mentioned, the defense, no doubt about it, has been terrible pretty much the whole season here. But it's only a 1 week matchup-based thing. And if you're desperate for a defense, the Bears, like I mentioned, give up the 5th most fantasy points to DSTs. And right now, he's available in 97% of fantasy leagues. And the 5th and final defense I look to get on the wires, the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks, surprisingly, the last few games for fantasy owners have been pretty decent in terms of putting up fantasy points. They're available right now in 50% of fantasy leagues. Week 14 at Houston, 13 points allowed, 2 sacks in that one. Week 15 at the Rams in that game, 20 points allowed, 4 sacks in an intho. And week 16 versus the Bears, 25 points allowed, 4 sacks. And right here, week 17, a great matchup at home for the Seattle with the 12th man as well versus the Detroit Lions. that give up the 7th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And the Lions, we know they're one of the worst teams in all of pro football at 2-12-1 on the season. So I think Seattle can make a few plays in this game. I think they should get to Jared Goff a few times as well. And Goff should be back in this game after missing Week 16 with COVID. But still, that don't make a difference to me here. So I think Seattle has another good week this week, and they're good pickups. So that's a few DST units I'd look to get on the wire here. Week 17 of the fantasy football season.